Welcome to our monthly Innovation, Knowledge and Inclusive Development Seminar series at Open University. I am Dinar Kale and I'm a professor of innovation and development here at OU. We are delighted to welcome you all for an amazing seminar today. The seminar will be presented by Dr. Nabila Idris. She is a visiting fellow at the Open University. She has completed her PhD from the University of Cambridge, and her research focuses on the politics of policymaking concerning social protection. The title of the seminar is Rice is a Political Commodity, the Food versus Cash Transfer Debate in Bangladesh. Before starting, some rules. The video is being recorded and will be available for playback after, so people who don't want to be featured can ask the questions in Q&A or ask to remain anonymous. We are automatically muted, but please raise your hands if you want to ask a question. And there is a Twitter account which Craig X account which Twitter Craig will put in the chat, and you can also use that and follow us on that. So without much ado, I will hand over to Nabila. Nabila, you have already been gone through some of the the timings and all that. Just 5 minutes before, I will raise my hand or I will switch on my camera, so you will know it's 5 minutes before the completion. Okay? Yes. All over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you, Dinar. And if I get things wrong in terms of sharing my screen, please do point it out. I hope it's sharing now. Thank you so much for organizing this event. I'm truly grateful. The technical bit always escapes me, and you've done a wonderful job in managing that, coaching me through it, so I'm very grateful. The topic I'll talk about today is rice is a political commodity. This is a quotation from one of the bureaucrats I was interviewing for this piece of research, and it struck me, and it's stuck with me since then. This is essentially going to be about the food and cash transfer debate in Bangladesh. So I'm going to first give you a bit of an introduction in terms of the theoretical debate itself. And then what we're going to do is we're going to look at how this debate played out in real life when a policy was being made in Bangladesh, and the contrast that we see between what is theory and what is actually being considered when such policies are being made. The contrast is very stark because we spend a lot of time, especially with things like universalism versus targeting or food versus cash transfers. We spend a lot of time in the theoretical debate. We spend time arguing what is more efficacious, what works, what doesn't work. And then we go to the real world of policymaking, and things start looking very different with lots of different modalities and different reasons and rationales that come into play. And I hope I'll be able to get that across to you today. That is my main goal. So the theoretical debate between food and cash. Cash transfers, they provide beneficiaries with the purchasing power to acquire goods as whatever they want to do, they can buy. In-kind transfers, they give beneficiaries the access to the goods that the government decides they need access to. So the government purchases the good and hands it over to the beneficiary. In terms of cash transfers, it's kind of obvious why cash transfers have a whole such sway, because it gives personal autonomy. So if I or you buy something, you go to the market and you buy it because you know you need it and therefore you buy it. And if you get something that you don't need, for example, suppose somebody gives you a basket of, I can't imagine, what is it that I do not like eating, but somebody else might like eating? No, I like eating many things. All right, somebody gives you a basket of something that you don't particularly want. There's a chance that you would just go and give it to somebody else who can then sell it onwards. So what it ends up doing, if you get in kind rather than cash, is that you will end up giving it away at a lower cost because you don't really want it anyway. Whatever you get for it is good. And that private trader can then sell it at a higher cost. Overall, you end up subsidizing, the government ends up subsidizing private traders. On the other hand, you have the explanation for why food transfers may happen and why some societies still choose it is paternalism. Suppose if people have very detrimental views of the poor, and the arguments like, oh, if you give them cash, they're just going to waste it on gambling or drinking, and so we're just going to give them food. That sort of reasoning sometimes goes behind food transfers. And in fact, even if it is found empirically to be untrue, taxpayers still may think this, and therefore they may support giving food transfers. So this may be a matter of meeting taxpayers' preferred mode of transfer, rather than a question of does it actually work. So efficacy may be left aside if taxpayers overall prefer it and have detrimental views of the poor. In the case of cash transfers, we see that, in the case of food transfers, there's a risk that it could create market distortion. So you send in a lot of food in an area, the area may not have needed that food, and the local price for that commodity falls, and you have lots of structural problems that come up as a result. On the other hand, this argument that is being made that food transfers are paternalistic, what I said earlier about detrimental views of the poor and thinking, oh, therefore we must give them food because we can't trust them with cash. It is interesting that we do not think the same thing about social housing or healthcare. Nobody says, oh, you must give people cash with which they can choose their own house. Instead, usually people say we're going to build social housing and people are going to choose to live in it whether they want money. You don't get a choice in what sort of house you live in case of social housing. Or in the case of healthcare, which I mean in the UK that is a debate that is ongoing, but in the UK the NHS is very popular. There is in fact pushback against thinking, oh, let's give everybody the cash and they can choose from private companies. Instead, you say, no, we give healthcare as a universal right because it works better that way. So the paternalism argument doesn't seem to always hold sway, but it does seem to hold sway when we're discussing food and cash. So there's a bit of an unexplained thinking there that needs to be worked out. And also in the case of this idea about paternalism, if the government suspects that the recipients have inadequate market information, then also people might want to give food transfers. So for example, instead of giving children money to buy, and you'd go like, oh, they'd buy sweets with it, you give tiffin at lunches, school lunches, and you give healthy and nutritious food there instead of giving them a choice to spend it on well, I would spend it on chocolate. So things like that. This debate isn't as clear cut as it usually appears to be. In the case of cash, you can look at some of the benefits. For instance, you get multiplier effects. So if you give somebody cash, he buys at his local market. This empowers the seller in the local market, who then becomes a buyer of something else in the local market. And then a whole lot of markets benefit from it. This does not exist with food. But on the other hand, with regards to food, suppose you have a scenario where there is natural disaster or war, then or even famine. In those instances, food just makes more sense because you could flood that area with money. But if you do not have supply of food, then that demand will not be effective. So in those instances, food transfers just make more sense. In other cases, people say, well, cash, if you give cash, then you could have inflation in that area. So you're handing out cash, you risk inflation. But this is not always true, because with something as basic as food, the supply of which is elastic, people could just make more food and people would buy more food. So it's not necessarily the case that this would cause inflation. There are, of course, the more standard arguments about against food transfers, which is they're logistically unwieldy. You've got to have aid trucks come in, you've got to arrange fuel, you've got to give it security. And then even in the process of transfer, there's a whole lot of leakages that happen regularly where food transfers are concerned, in the process of handling, transit, and storage. On the other hand, sometimes you may not really get a choice but to do food transfers. This is usually true, for example, when excuse me, I've got a bad cough. This is usually true when there are domestic business interests in food exporting countries or donor countries, where they give aid on the condition that it would have to be the food from the donor country. It's a way for governments to dump a lot of their food in developing markets. So that's kind of the theoretical debate. What we're going to do is see how that theoretical debate plays out in Bangladesh. In Bangladesh, you have both kinds of transfers. You've got food transfers and you have cash transfers. Both happen simultaneously. Food transfers have some of the highest coverage in our country. In contrast, the budgetary allocation for cash transfers is the highest. Most cash transfers run throughout the year, whereas food transfers are usually activated seasonally when there are in some areas there are risks of food shortages, or during emergencies such as our country is very prone to natural disasters. So in the case of a flood or a hurricane or something of that kind, you send out food because that people don't necessarily have access to food at that point. Now, cash transfers usually now use banks or mobile financial services, whereas food transfers still require in-person collection. Now, the policy I'm going to look at where this debate plays out, this debate between food and cash transfers, the policy is called the National Social Security Strategy. This strategy was people came up with this strategy. It's a part of a very wide effort across various countries. So since 2010, 30 African countries have adopted national social protection strategies. Almost 2/3 of African nations have a strategy of this kind by now. And adopting such a strategy is seen to be quite a progressive thing. So because it can help achieve 14 of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. In Bangladesh as well, there was a wave of adopting such strategies, and in Bangladesh, we kind of jumped onto that bandwagon. But our gestation period for this strategy was very long. It was a 10-year process for various reasons that I go into in my thesis, but will not bore you with today. But for various reasons, the gestation period was very long. It was from 2005 to 2015. And it's a very significant document because it encompasses all the country's social protection strategies, right? So if you try to understand the social protection debates in Bangladesh and you look at the making of this strategy, you'd get a bird's eye view of all the debates because it encompasses all the country's social protection strategies. So that's kind of what I ended up doing across my thesis, where every chapter looks at a different debate that happened when the strategy was made. And the one I'm presenting to you today is the one on the food versus cash transfer debate. So this is what the strategy document looks like from the top. And my methodology, I did 15 kgs of document analysis. I know it is 15 kgs because there was a suitcase and I was so afraid of losing my documents, my hard copies, that and don't ask me why I didn't have digitized formats. I did have digitized formats. I didn't trust them because I had notes in the hard copies. Anyway, so I was so afraid of losing them that when I would travel from country to country, I had a suitcase where I carried this and I had to subtract 15 kgs from whatever luggage allowance I always had. This is how, anyway, now you know, empirically, I know I carried 15 kgs of documents and I analyzed it for this study. I did qualitative in-depth interviews, 61 of them, 11 within ministry, so bureaucrats, 16 with civil society members, 16 with donor and international organizations, 9 consultants, 9 experts. And then I used to do participant observation in that I would sit in on policy deliberation places where these things were being discussed. So meetings, consultations, trainings, conferences. I did that in Bangladesh and I did that in Thailand, which as the regional hub used to host several of these sort of meetings and consultations. So I did all of that for quite some time, like a year before I ended up writing about it. So let's look at the policy itself. With regards to food and cash, the policy it kind of oscillates. At first, it gives a radical proposal. It says that, look, we're going to do away with all food transfers because cash is just fundamentally better. And we would convert all food transfer-based programs into cash transfers. It was like a call to war and radical reform idea that, and the document was very confident that that is how things would happen. And there's a reason for this confidence, because over the next 3 iterations, it remains. Many other things undergo changes in the document, but this issue that all food transfers would be converted to cash remains undebated, and nothing touches it for 3 iterations of that document. And then suddenly in the 4th iteration, there's somehow somebody's clearly gotten hands on the document to say, no, you're not going to end up doing this. And the terminology begins changing. So it says, instead of saying all food transfer programs would be converted to cash, it says, no, we're just going to convert the workfare-based food programs into cash. So it kind of limits the scope. And then it does a second thing, which is what it was previously arguing, that it would just do it immediately. Like everything would be converted, don't worry about it. But it then starts introducing phrases like in a longer term perspective, that in the long run we will do this, which is government speak for we have no plans to do it, but we've got to write it anyway. And it then adds like a caveat, which is that no, we all agree cash is better, but we're still going to retain food, right? So a general consensus, there exists a general consensus amongst the concerned policymakers and officials that cash transfer programs are a much better option. It literally writes that. So you must think, well, if you think it's a better option, why are you going back from your proposal? Like, you had already decided that you were going to convert to cash, and now you're turning around and retracing your steps, but at the same time you're saying, but we still think our previous decision was better. So the reason for the scaled back reform agenda is a question that I felt was worth asking. And then I spent a lot of time trying to answer that question, which is what I will share with you today. I will answer that question, and hopefully you find it as interesting as I found it. Okay, so there are overall 3 overarching reasons why, despite deciding that cash is better, the government cannot actually implement that decision, does not think it practical to implement that decision. The first reason is that there is the colonial legacy of the public food distribution system. And unless you are from the subcontinent, you may not really recognize what a ubiquitous part of our life this legacy is, but I will try to get it across to you. So in the Second World War, we're in the midst of the Second World War, and the Japanese army is occupying Rangoon. So this is very much the Eastern Front. It's about to come into Bengal. It's in that sort of a scenario. The Japanese army is that close. And because of that proximity to the war front, this entire region was, the Bengal province was just adjacent to that war front. Our food supply chain was disrupted. And it was the same year that there was a natural disaster, which destroyed several natural disasters, actually, which destroyed crops. And also, because there was a colonial government in power, which didn't really care about these brown natives, it diverted food supplies to feed the war machine. So you had rural food stocks being taken into Kolkata, which is the provincial capital, and being made available to the urban class for various reasons. They said the provincial authorities, in order to do that, passed emergency legislation, set up a central food department. And the reason for confiscating food was not just to feed the people of the capital, but also to deny food to the Japanese army, advancing Japanese army, so that that would create problems for their troops. So you had incidents like this happening, right? So this is, I'm sorry, can you see what I'm sharing?
Yes,
Okay,
we can see it. Yeah.
All right. So you have incidents like this where emaciated bodies start appearing in the streets of Kolkata, and people die in large numbers. 1.5 to 3 million people starve to death, the majority in rural Bengal. So what happens in Kolkata? Like, why give the food to Kolkata? Why reroute through Kolkata? This is because it is in Kolkata, which is the capital, and this is, you'll see me talk about this in second famine. This is just in many ways the norm of what happens here, which is that the industrial labor force is in Kolkata, the army is in Kolkata, the government administrators are in Kolkata, and near the border there are the Japanese. So it just made so much sense to pass the food here, but in doing so, you had just belts of death in the rural population where people starved to death. But at the same time, even in Kolkata, you had daily air raids, right? And that panic that spread, it encouraged panic purchases, hoarding, speculation, which just fueled that famine. And so not only was there a food availability decline, there was also a food, so your ability to demand the food also declined, right? Food entitlement decline also happened. After the famine ended, so you have 1.5 to 3 million people starving to death. This sort of deaths, which happens in front of you, where you can eat, but your fellow citizen can't, where people die straight in front of you, children die, women die, old people die, elderly die because they're most vulnerable. This leaves a scar on the psyche of a nation. And that certainly left one on the psyche of Bengal. which is we developed a fear of private speculators, which, I mean, partially this is ironic because it is, of course, the colonial government that diverted the food stocks. But from the standpoint of your average Kolkatan, what they could see was the reason their food market did not have, their kitchen market did not have food, was because private speculators were removing it from the market. So the fear that developed within the urban educated class was fear of private speculators, and that is the fear that remained. So the food department emergency legislation that had passed, the food, that set up food department and had set up the public food distribution system, that continued even after the war. The war is over, the famine is over, but the department remains and the system remains. Now, when Bangladesh comes into existence, which is in 1971, that department is still remained. That idea of public food distribution system that came into being in the early 1940s, that remains, and we inherit it. Now, when we inherit it, what it means is that the government must always retain stocks with which it can control the market should private speculators start removing food from the market. So the assumption being that the speculator will remove, but the government, using its own stock, will fill in the market, and at which point it will become burdensome and economically stupid of the speculator to remove the food, and so they won't remove the food. They will not gamble with this, right? So what that essentially means is the government will have to retain food stocks. That becomes an accepted norm across the region, and there is a broad consensus in Bangladesh that that amount of food stock is about 1 million metric tons. And at current technology levels, these stocks, usually rice, will have, because that's the staple, will have a lifespan of 9 to 12 months, which means that every 9 to 12 months you have to rotate the stock, because otherwise that is rotten stock and you can't use it, right? So as this debate was ongoing, the Ministry of Food wrote a memo. It was like an 8-page rebuttal, which is like, I have to say, not a fan of bureaucratic government writing, but this memo, big fan. It was written very well. And I'll read out to you one of the key arguments it made. Because what it is essentially is arguing, what this bureaucrat was arguing was, if you have to rotate stock every 9 to 12 months, and you have to send out 1 million metric tons of rice into the market, then what will happen is you will distort the market, and you will create all forms of pathologies that you can't afford. But you have to get rid of the stock anyway. Now, besides throwing it out into the river, what you could do is you could give it out as food transfers. And it won't be too much of a problem, because people who receive food transfers receive it because they do not have the purchasing power to buy it from the normal market anyway. So if they weren't going to buy it from the market anyway, and you give them the food, no harm to you. So this is the way, if you do it this way, if you rotate the stock by giving the food out as transfers, then it has minimum distorting impact on the market. You can also rotate the stock. You can also keep these poor people fed. Overall, it's a dreamy scenario. And since this dreamy scenario exists, and you've got to do it anyway because you have to have the public food distribution system, then you can't get rid of food transfers. Because what are you going to do with the rotting stock if you get rid of food transfers? And if you start giving them cash, what is going to happen to this rotting stock? Nobody wants to buy the rotting stock, so you'll just be stuck with it. And this was a very convincing argument. And I'm sure you find it convincing as well, because it is convincing. It makes complete sense. It is an all-in-one solution for quite a tricky problem. But it is convincing only because the government here in this part of the world accepts that you must have a public food distribution system. It is not necessary. It is not necessarily true for all societies to accept this as a logic, because all societies do not accept it as a logic. But because of this colonial inheritance that we have of the public food distribution system, it is just how in this part of the world we envision the government's role to be. And because that part cannot be debated, the question of rotting stocks and what to do with that becomes a question. And you do it by getting rid of food, or getting rid of the stock, doing the stock rotation with food transfers. Now, this is interesting because remember at the very beginning of the talk, I told you about the theoretical debate between cash and food. This comes up nowhere in the theoretical debate. But this is what proved to be the clincher in the argument when Bangladesh was writing this policy. So that's the first reason that I gave you, which is that the colonial legacy of the public food distribution system means that there must be a way to rotate stocks. And if there must be a way to rotate stocks without distorting the market, you have to be able to give the stock out as food transfers. So that's one. The second one, this is called the subsistence crisis contract. Now, the issue of path dependence, which is like, the PFDS comes and the PFDS remains, the public food distribution remains, it makes sense. But what we also need to answer is, there are many colonial legacies. There are many colonial laws that do not remain. Why does this one stick? There must be a logic for why this one stuck and other things didn't. Because colonial powers made a lot of laws. We have gotten rid of many of them, but this one we didn't. And the reason we didn't is because very soon after our independence, after Bangladesh's independence in 1971, there was a famine, the 1974 famine. And that left its own mark. So this is a photo from the 1974 famine. You can see how eerily similar it is to the photo I showed you earlier. Like, okay, the people have changed, their clothes have changed, it's in color, the other one wasn't. But this idea of the emaciated poor coming in, walking in from the rural areas, and then just quite simply dying in front of you, and that thing that it does to your psyche, that remains unchanged. And you can see how a nation or a people that over 2 generations gets this message would then think, wait, stop, never again, and I will take some steps to stop it. So what happens? The reason for the 1974 famine, there's a lot of debate. Some people say that it is because of food availability decline. So because food aid stopped when Bangladesh sent some jute bags or something to Cuba, and Americans took revenge. That is true, but Amartya Sen, I think, did a wonderful job to show that actually in 1974, Bangladesh had quite high food availability. And what was actually missing was the rural population's ability to purchase the food, to command the food. And this happened for a range of reasons. So you had, again, that issue of speculation, hoarding, and smuggling. Like previously, remember, private speculators in 1942, they do that thing in Kolkata, and it hurts people's abilities to access food. This happens in Bangladesh in 1974 as well. So you have smuggling, speculation, hoarding by political influential actors, which pushes up the prices, making it go out of the affordability range of the poor. So you again have that where the poor in the rural areas start walking. This is again, it happened in 1942, 43, happens again in 74, where people who are hungry simply leave their homes and they start walking in search of food. And they trickle into Dhaka. Again, you see that thing about food is in the capital, it happens in Kolkata, now happens in Dhaka. And when this emaciated poor, they come in, the government puts them into camps, and with there they die by the thousands. But the public food distribution system, it continues to supply food to, again, the same people that it supplied to before, which is state employees, urban, politically influential constituents still continue to get food. This is a diary page from my father's diary. Like, he was a child then. I think he was sitting his school ending exam. And it's just, and he was in the rural areas, right? But he was from a financially comfortable family in the rural area. And I remember when I first read through this diary, it was like a glimpse into another world that I'd only read about in books that suddenly came to life. And I realized, oh, this is something that just my father witnessed. It left a mark in how my father thought. And so here he's talking about how all these people don't have any food, and they're eating what the pigs eat, and yet their bodies have become emaciated and their skeletons have come out, and he's horrified. As a young boy, he's horrified by it, and he's writing, I want to know what I can do about them, because I can't spend my time. He had his school ending exam coming up, and previous to this trip he'd been studying, so he said, I can't study anymore, this has traumatized me. And this happens across the country. The country is traumatized. So 2% of the country's population die. And in the Bangladeshi psyche, this is down to government ineptness, corruption, and failure. And that, starved to death 1.5 million of their fellow citizens. In fact, there is a response in some ways right after, where in 1974, the president at that time, Sheikh Mujib, a hero up until then, because of his role in the 71 war, is assassinated. In fact, this right now in Bangladesh, we've had a revolution last year, so I can speak about it freely. But when I was writing this and when I used to talk about it earlier, I had to be quite careful in how I phrased myself, because this is a politically, this was, I have to say, this was a politically sensitive issue. So when I was reading through the documents that the government deliberations that happened when making this policy, when I was reading through the documents, one of it had a meeting minute where they said, remove mention of a sentence from that document because it is politically sensitive. So it was in the meeting minutes and it didn't say what sentence. So I remember looking through every iteration until I found the one that matched, the policy document that matched the one right before that meeting. And I found the revised document. And what they'd removed from it was any mention of the 1974 famine. And this is because Sheikh Mujib's daughter, Sheikh Hasina, our erstwhile dictator, was in power until last year. And so you weren't allowed to talk about the famine freely. Now I can. But that thing about that link between famine and political legitimacy, it struck the rulers of Bangladesh. Like, the Bangladeshi people recognize that if you do not give people food, then that's quite risky. So they will point to the loss of political legitimacy. And even military dictators took note. So in 1979, in 1984, there were floods, there were food scares, but in all cases, the government, even military dictators, stepped in with their public food distribution systems to manage the scare. So the idea of getting rid of the public food distribution system simply quite never occurred to anybody, even after we got independence in 1971, because right after independence, a hard lesson was learned in what happens if government doesn't give food. So this message, I had thought, would dissipate over time, because in 1992 we had market liberalization, which means we reduced our reliance on food stocks and we started buying food from India basically and some other nations. Rice trading increased. And if that increases, then you don't really need to keep stocks anymore, because you can just, if you have a flood and your country cannot make the rice, just buy it from the next country. But in 2007, there was an incident where you had severe crop destruction from 2 floods and a cyclone, food stocks, because by then government had gotten a bit careless, didn't think that you really needed food. You could always get food from India if you wanted to. You can trade through the borders. So the public food stocks were low, and borders with India were closed because I think India also was not allowing export of food. So you couldn't meet that demand by import. And so the government in power at that point, which was a military-backed government, stayed for 2 years, could not control food prices. And the reason they stayed for 2 years is they kind of very peacefully stepped aside into just within 2 years when they couldn't control food prices. This gave a message again about political legitimacy. If you cannot give food to the people, you're going to lose political legitimacy. So the Ministry of Food memo argued that the need to build a buffer stock to rise to the occasion in times of crisis can hardly be overemphasized. Like, it doesn't matter if you are going to get crisis, but as long as the possibility exists of a crisis, you must have a buffer. You must have buffer stock. Now, I remember asking this question to various bureaucrats. I asked them, where is this sudden imperative to rise to the occasion? I don't see Bangladeshi state wanting to rise to the occasion to provide housing or healthcare. People die for lack of healthcare and housing. Why is it that food makes you think you've got to rise to the occasion, so that you spend so much money behind maintaining these stocks and coming up with innovative ways of getting rid of the stock and refilling your silos? Why for food and not anything else? And this cabinet division official told me, a hungry man is an angry man. And another official, the one who told me, rice is a political commodity. Rice is the only thing in Bangladesh that can topple a government. See, the issue is political legitimacy, because in the case of the 1942-43 famine, the British government left by 1944. Come the 1974 famine, Sheikh Mujib is assassinated by the end of 1974. Come the 2009 food scare, food price shocks, the government has to step aside immediately. 2007-8 food price shock, government has to step aside by 2009. This has hammered it into the Bangladeshi policymaking psyche that if you do not give food properly, you will this is a mistake that you cannot afford to make. So it's developed into a subsistence crisis contract. It's developed into a zeitgeist in Bangladesh. So a bureaucrat said to me, the government is obligated to keep food stocks. It is obligated irrespective of which party is in power. If there are food stocks, there has to be outlet channels through the food transfer programs. So it is impossible to shift fully to cash. It's not viable. To protect its own political interests, no government will do it, right? So you now start seeing why at the very beginning of that policy document, which had been written by consultants, foreign consultants, so they'd written, oh, we're going to move to cash because cash makes a lot of sense. But as the policy document had progressed across the bureaucracy, the bureaucrats had begun to understand that it might work elsewhere, it might work theoretically, but in Bangladesh, there are these political contexts based on our history that prevents us from going fully into food. And again, let me just remind you how at the very beginning we discussed the theoretical issues about the food versus cash transfers, the debates that we keep having. They've got no bearing on how this policy is being made. What is having bearing are ideas left over by history. All right, now that we have an answer to that, what it still doesn't explain is why then does the policy document still say things like, in the longer term perspective, we might move to cash, or, you know, cash is still better. Like, where does that come from? Where does that zeal for reform in the longer term perspective come from? And that's what I'm going to try to answer in the third part of my presentation. Now, this is about the effect of farmers and how much power they have over competing factions. This is because the public food distribution system is a two-in-one tool to resolve the food price dilemma. What is the food price dilemma? The dilemma is that on one hand, food prices must be kept at an affordable level so that you and I can buy the food. Otherwise, we'll go hungry. On the other hand, if the food prices are too affordable, like if they're too low, then there wouldn't be high enough for farmers to be incentivized to produce food, because they'll think, oh, it doesn't matter. I will not benefit from producing food. There's no profit in it, so I won't produce food. So it's just this. It's the food distribution system is supposed to be a two-in-one tool to solve that. And how will it solve that? Because it sets the ceiling price for consumers, but floor price for farmers, because the farmers, because this is a huge effort to buy from farmers. So farmers can always expect to sell to this, to these stocks, to replenish the stocks. And therefore, it would give farmers a price guarantee. Like, even if you cannot sell in the market, at least the government would buy it from you. But the problem is that the government buys only a very small fraction of the harvest, right? Because the government only stores 1 million metric tons, which means that the market price can easily be lower than the government's procurement price, because the government is buying such a small fraction of the market. Big farmers and market intermediaries like rice millers, they take advantage of the system to sell to the government stocks, the stocks at the detriment of the small farmers and peasants. So if they come in with their big stocks and they have better political connections, small peasants cannot compete with that, which allows them to set up a monopoly. And so because of this monopoly, they buy at a low price from farmers and then sell to the government at a huge markup, which means at the end of the day, the farmers lose out here anyway. And there is no way that the farmers can compete with this. They are not, in Bangladesh, farmers are not powerful. This is different from, say, India, where you will look at a lot of farmer protests and they come to the headlines. In Bangladesh, it is not like that. Farmers are not powerful for various historical reasons. We're quite spread out. And this sort of politics has simply not taken hold in our country historically. And so although the government needs to maintain a food stock, it doesn't need to maintain the food stock by buying from farmers. It can buy from the millers and it'll be fine with that. So as long as the government can buy from the millers and it doesn't need to buy a lot anyway, the farmers do not present a political threat to it. And so if it can store that rice longer, that, that 1 million metric ton of rice it buys, if the government can store that rice longer, there would be no one pushing the government to buy more rice, because that power doesn't exist in the farmers. So if the government can store the rice longer, then it would not need to keep buying rice every 9 to 12 months. Because as long as it can store it longer, it can, maybe if it can store it for 3 years, then it only needs to buy that 1 million metric tons of rice the next, like 3 years later. What this means is it wouldn't need to turn over stocks that much. Now it needs, the silos need to be emptied every 9 to 12 months, every year, and new rice needs to come in. But if you can increase your, if you can better your technology and you can increase your storage duration, then you only need to change that rice every 3 years. So in the middle 2 years, you don't need to get rid of any rice. You can give out cash, right? And the government is indeed, because again, farmers do not have any political sway here. There is no one pushing back on the government to say, don't do something where the farmers will have even less of a market. The government is actually, in fact, making technologically advanced modern food storage facilities where they can store grains up to 3 times longer. Now, in that scenario, because they do not have to do the food transfers, the government can put in that policy document that in a longer term perspective, we can move more to cash, because they know that over time, as long as these facilities are built, the pressure on them to rotate food stocks will reduce. Now, I read this entire episode, the colonial food hangover, colonial food distribution system hangover, the effect of the 1974 famine in telling us that you must give food, otherwise you will lose political legitimacy. And then finally, the lack of power of farmers to fight back in the system where the consumer matters, but the producer does not. I read this through a political settlements lens, which, for those of you who already know, political settlements is a combination of power and institutions that is mutually compatible and sustainable in terms of economic and political viability. So once it has reached that compatibility, it becomes stable. The system becomes stable. And when it becomes stable, you see that reform projects become that much harder. So this is my final slide. This is the political settlement analysis of what I described up until now, which is that the idea that is key in the system in Bangladesh is that famines jeopardize regime stability. If there is a famine, your government is going to fall. In the 1940s, it was the British Raj. In the 70s, it was Sheikh Mujib's government. In the 2000s, it was 2009. It was the military-backed government, with 3 substantially strong governments falling because of food scares. It has ingrained into our psyche the idea that famines jeopardize regime stability. So you cannot have anything that messes with your ability, with the ability of consumers to eat food. So because that is the guiding principle, you then have different actors in the field who bring in their own powers and their own bargaining tools with which to fight here. So you have politicians who bring in policymaking monopoly. You have market intermediaries like those rice millers I told you about. They bring in market control, technology, and political influence. Donors bring in food aid. Farmers bring in their ability to protest. Now, we already know that farmers' protestability does not seem to hold much sway, so their weapon is not strong enough. Donor food aid dependency has decreased in Bangladesh, so again, not strong enough weapon. Market intermediaries are powerful, politicians are powerful. So then against the two the 2 actors with weak weapons, you've got 2 actors with strong weapons. They then sustain a set of institutions, which is the national food stock. So you have to keep food, and you have to have food stock turnover. This distributes benefits in a very particular way. So private traders benefit from it, politicians benefit from it, because they're the ones with the most weapons. And because they're the ones with the most weapon and they benefit from it, they get the economic rent and the political rent. They then can use that weapon in that distribution of holding power. So you can see how this becomes quite a stable system. And the moment it becomes a stable system, it is that much harder to change, which is why that reform proposal kind of oscillated until it came back to where the political settlement was. And in all of this, again, I want to point out that first bit of discussion I had on the food versus cash transfer debate, where we debated, where we looked into the theory of it, None of it mattered. It didn't matter in reaching this political settlement at all. And I think that's for me, that was one of the key takeaways, like, because, I'd already I was doing my PhD at that point, so I'd spent so much time reading so many theoretical papers on the food versus cash transfers debate. And then when it came to the real world, I saw, whoa, that had no sway whatsoever in how the policy was made. And I hope we remember that as we go do our policy influencing work that academics tend to do, and try to understand the real scenario and the practicalities of it, as wherein we add our theory in aid of the practice as opposed to the other way around. Thank you, and I'm happy to take questions.
Many thanks, Nabila. You're perfectly in time and really insightful. And growing up in India, I can see some of the lots of similarities with what you are describing about the food and cash transfer and how it is changing. And your observation about the farmer protest and influence of farmer lobby on changing the policy or not changing the policy is so significant in India that nothing will change. Even the but yeah, let's take the questions from. I have some questions, but let's take the questions from the audience. Everyone will have Craig, I think you have unmuted, and let me see if people can raise their hands. And yes, let me see if you.
Can I just ask, have I stopped sharing my
Yeah,
screen?
you have stopped sharing. Yeah, thanks.
You have. Dinar, can I just come in for a second? Just
Yeah.
to apologize. Teams seems to be really temperamental today, so I'm trying to release the permissions. So if you could just bear with me, but if anybody has the questions, maybe we could just post them in the chat for now as I try and sort it out in the background. Sorry for this.
Okay, it seems to be creating some challenges.
One of those
Let's
days.
2 minutes. We will sort it out. 2 minutes. By the way, Kitty has left, but she has put a really nice comment about the presentation, and she asking, has this been published outside your thesis? So hopefully, she will be in touch.
The shame.
No worries. You have other responsibility. So I'll just till maybe sort it out. I just want to ask this question. In Indian case, for you can see there has been a gradual movement from food transfer to the cash transfer, and so and again, there is a lot of criticism from upper middle classes saying, oh, this is really, waste of, but still, it is really critical for politicians to do this cash transfer, specifically focus on the women voters, and once you start that scheme, it's difficult to. So what's your observation that why a country, where the India and Bangladesh has lots of similarities in terms of the political systems, where the politicians seems to be moving away gradually from the food transfer to the cash transfer, and it seems to be challenging in Bangladesh context. Is there any observation in that sense?
I mean, that's a wonderful question. I must first preface that by saying my understanding of the Indian context will be so worse than yours. So this is going to be more of a generalizable answer than anything. Cash transfers are in vogue. That's one of the things I think that really matters. So if you compare to the Bangladeshi context, you see, even though Bangladeshi bureaucrats totally understood that for us to get rid of food is not even an option, even in that scenario, they kept saying cash is better, cash is better, cash is better. Because to central policymakers and central bureaucrats, like central government bureaucrats, cash makes a lot more sense because they've got way more control over cash than food. You can give it directly. So G2P transfers, you can do it. They tend to, central bureaucrats tend to look down on local level bureaucrats all the time. So they think they're the ones who waste money. We in the central, we're the best. And so they never want to, they always want to retain power over it. As well as what you just said about that thing with regards to politicians, vote buying. You give it to women, you get the votes. All of this has created, even in Bangladesh, as I said, that they are all on board with the idea of cash. It's just they can't get rid of that 1 million metric ton. That's the difference. My suspicion is that in India, because your farmer lobby historically is so much stronger, and I've tried to understand why that is. I remember thinking about it because it's just the inverse of Bangladesh. It's just inverse. The entire thing is just inverse. So my suspicion is your food stocks are probably much higher than ours. We just maintain 1 million metric tons. You probably maintain lots of millions. And that is not necessarily just a matter of population size. It is also probably a matter of politics, because your farmer lobbies are strong. They will insist you buy from them. So all of that stuff comes into play. And but on the other hand, since cash is in vogue, there is always a push towards it. Again, unless your farmers lose power, I don't think it's going to work. As in Bangladesh, unless the consumer loses power, the political settlement is stable.
Interesting, very interesting. I will take the last question he has put in Q&A. Given the stability of the rice stock policy, aren't there other aspects of the agri-food policy that matter for the political, economic power of farmers?
Given the, I missed the first part.
I will repeat. Sorry, if, and it's in the Q&A if you can. Given the stability of the rice stock policy, aren't there other aspects of agri-food policy that matter for the political, economic power of farmers?
It's a good question. The reason why the rice stock issue matters is because usually these debates are won and lost based on volumes. Rice is the staple, so it has to be produced at the largest volume. If farmers do not win the debate on rice, then there is no other food product that has the ubiquity where they can win the debate, you see? So if it is about increasing the political power of farmers, then what can they bargain with that they can win on that they cannot win with rice? Because rice is the one that people must have, a lot of people must have, it must be in the market. Like that's the one that ought to be the biggest bargaining tool. If you cannot win with that, everything else is for smaller markets with smaller market shares, and then it's much harder. So no, I think this isn't just a matter of, I would be surprised if this is just a matter in Bangladesh as a whole. So look at wheat markets, for instance. Because wheat is a staple, the market there is, with the volatility and speculation and so on and so forth, it happens with the staple market because the staple market is just strong enough and large enough for this sort of things to happen. So, I mean, that's a great question, but as far as I am aware, there aren't other products in the food market in Bangladesh where even farmers would have more sway than they would have over rice. And if they can't win over rice, then very little chance of winning in any other arena.
Thanks for that, Nabila. Everyone's mic and camera should be on because it seems like I could do it. Craig was struggling. So, Les, if you want to have follow-up question, and we can also test, you want to ask the follow-up question? You're muted.
I think we've got a question from Theo.
Okay. So, well, and there are no other, no stronger policy issues around rice other than the stock. Is that the situation?
Oh, whether there are other stronger policy issues around rice that would have political impact. No, there's no other tool. Like this is a bargain. It's a question of like different actors with bargaining power, right? I mean, holding power. No, not that I'm aware of.
I mean, like in India, there's for a decade or two, there've been strong policies to push some farmers to produce for export. But maybe not in Bangladesh.
We can't even think about that. We've got to import food for our own people, so we're not an exporting market for rice.
Okay.
And rice is a very thinly traded good anyway. I think there are only 7% of it is traded across the world. So remember what I said earlier about India even closing its borders to us at several points, not allowing us to import rice. Because not a lot of countries have rice as a staple food. The international market for it isn't as big as, say, wheat. So there's not a lot of speculation or anything that happens in the rice market. That stuff happens in the wheat market, just a different sort of market.
Thanks, Nabil. Theo, you want to say your question? Ask your question. Sorry, your mic should be on. Yeah.
Hi. Thanks very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, great presentation. Thanks very much. Very, very interesting. I just wanted to ask about this relationship, this tension between political legitimacy and distribution of food or cash transfers. because it seems to me that there's another element to that, which is how democratic a government or a state is. And it seems to me that liberal democratic states are more likely to blame market failure, for example, for the failure of the distribution of food or for cash transfers, and therefore less likely to lose political legitimacy in that sense, just because of a failure to distribute food in cases of emergency or in other cases. So I was wondering whether you can actually specify a little bit whether you assume particular type of governments or states where you've got the likelihood to lose political legitimacy, given all these historical elements, very interesting that you have presented.
I think that's a really, really interesting question. And I would argue that no, it isn't about the type of government. When an idea becomes the zeitgeist, it is not about the type of government. And the reason I would argue this is because across the history of Bangladesh, we've had our range of leaders, autocratic, dictator, we've just come out of one, democratic, we've had it all. Across that entire gamut, the issue of food being tied to politicians' legitimacy has remained constant. And my evidence for that is that it doesn't matter what type of government is in place, the moment you have any sort of scare in the food market with regards to staples, these food stock trucks come out. Like, just you have a flood, food stocks come out. You have, for some reason, some speculation happens in the market, food stocks come out. Even autocratic governments, well, your argument is that democratic governments or liberal Democrats would blame the market failure. Question is not what the government would blame. The question is what the people would buy. And in this instance, in Bangladesh, in Bengal as a whole, because of our history, this idea of political legitimacy is linked to the ability of the government to at least provide staple food, just subsistence crisis context. We're not talking about a contract where they say, give me good balanced diet and nutrition. We have no such desires. We just need to not be able to die from lack of food. That's the bare minimum. So yes, a liberal democratic government might argue that, oh, how could I give it? There just wasn't, India wasn't opening its border, so I couldn't import any food and the market failed. It could argue that, but people would not listen to it. People would say it is your fundamental failure that you couldn't give me food, so now you need to leave. And the people have shown that with regards to really powerful government leaders. For example, Sheikh Mujib was a dictator. The military government was the military-backed government is a military-backed government. The British Raj. In all these cases, the people responded by saying, "Get out and leave." They lost the political legitimacy. So if those strong men had to, then democratic governments don't even try playing with this. So democratic governments, in fact, become more responsive and ensure that there definitely is food in the market in case of a scare. I hope that answers the question.
Theo, you have any follow-up?
Thanks. Yeah. I mean, the only point I wanted to make, just an addition, is that, I mean, you do have to assume, of course, that dictatorships and non-democratic governments don't have political legitimacy in the first place, right? So, I mean, that's why I'm asking the question. But thanks very much. I need to leave. Thanks a lot.
I just want to ask something follow-up, Nabila, in the sense that the post-revolution period, there is a the space where there is where lots of things happening in Bangladesh currently, which from rewriting constitution to the, isn't that the space which provides an opportunity for doing something as radical as this? So how is you think there will be a movement towards it, or or the status quo will stay? Because that's what the revolutions are for, to
Yes, thank you. look, I think my cynicism aside, I think we've made a lot of progress. Here I am talking, talking about the 1974 famine, saying stuff like, oh, he was a dictator, without checking my internet connection for potential attacks, right?
No, I see.
So I think already that space is there. Now, it would be really good if that also manifested itself in a proletarian revolution of a kind, where the farmers rose up and said, give me my rights. But I mean, of course, I would hope for that. But at this point, I'm very grateful to be able to say this out loud without fearing death. Big wins there.
It's just fascinating that there is such a big history of student movement, and been 100 years, like student movement in Bengal, it's been always been prominent,
Yes.
but nothing like farmers, which is you thought might be the more collective organized groups. So yeah, it's very fascinating, really interesting.
I've thought about it. I think one of the reasons is because we have such large swaths of the country devoted to farming. They're just not geographically concentrated enough. Students are in campuses. It's concentrated, and you can literally stand back to back. Farmers, they're spread out over such large areas. So you've got better factory protests than you have farmer protests, spread out over two large areas.
But India is the same in that context, no? But yeah,
So you
it's
do it
yeah,
well.
yeah. I think there is some, yeah, maybe the political economy question. Many thanks, Les. Marine, if you have any questions.
It's legacy. No.
Yeah,
Legacy, yes.
yeah, possible. Many thanks, Nabil. It was fascinating. You can see the chat as well. People have put so many comments, and we have recorded so the others who couldn't join will be circulating that, and we'll be looking forward to collaborating. People will contact you on their own, but also uh, really, if there are, we for our material, course material, and others, we can also possible we can use this as well. Okay.
Thank you so much for organizing it. I'm truly grateful.
Cheers. Have a good day. Okay. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Bye. Thanks.